Welcome to Talking Africa, the podcast that deconstructs the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. I'm Nicholas Norbrook. Welcome to the show. For the very latest news and analysis, please do visit our website, theafricareport.com. The trending story at the moment is Africa braces for Boris, a look at how the red-hot favourite to lead the UK has a history of throwing out cliched and offensive views about the continent, and how little Englander sentiment has been warring with free trade ideas in the UK for the last 100 years. This week on the pod, the next 100 years in Nigeria. We're looking at who will be part of the next Buhari government and what challenges await, who will make the cut, who will be dropped. Our West Africa editor, Eremo Egbejule, will be joining us in a moment on the line from Lagos. But first, I speak to Editor-in-Chief Patrick Smith about the stasis at the central bank.
Well, I think the important thing we know is with Emefiele being given a second term as governor of the central bank, and that hasn't actually happened since the early 80s. So it's quite an achievement actually for Emefiele. Is that we're likely to see his economic thinking that he's developed along with Buhari over the last 4 years. That's going to continue. And the others in the economic team are going to, work around that. And that means, I guess, 3 or 4 clear policies. That is the system of multiple exchange rates. So you get an official rate from the Naira, which is roughly sort of 305 Naira to the dollar. You get an investor's rate for the Naira, which is around 460. And then you get this sort of market rate, which is, it's not an illegal rate. It's you can buy the Naira, don't get prosecuted anymore for trading in that. And that's about 440 Nairas to the dollar. So it means if you're buying goods outside of the recommended imports, which they say are the imported absolutely essential commodities and things that the country needs, you can't get your Naira at the official rate, so you're going to have to pay 440 Naira to the dollar for that. So that looks likely that's going to continue. The idea is that Emefiele will defend the Naira. There are about $45 billion worth of reserves at the moment, so he's going to use those reserves if necessary to defend the Naira. So I don't see any possible change in that, certainly in the short term. In the long term, I mean, the idea of the policy is always going to be that there's a convergence of the rates, that multiple tier exchange rates are a sort of temporary expedient. But again, it hasn't converged much over the last 3 years. Initially, the multiple exchange rate system saw the rates wide apart because there were low foreign exchange earnings, oil price had bombed, and the reserves were being wound down. They're certainly in a better position. They're in a better position to carry on with that policy. The Naira bonds are also being tipped by all the financial consultants as a great buy for outsiders. Even maybe especially at that exchange rate. So
will you be buying yourself, Patrick?
Unfortunately, I'm waiting for the next paycheck. As soon as
I thought all journalists were incredibly rich, Patrick.
Yeah, no, it's all changed. Apparently, we used to be incredibly rich. Now we're incredibly poor. Tel Aviv. A lot of people say it's a terribly good thing. The other element is inflation, and that's going to be a critical issue. It's a very sensitive issue for Buhari, and it's one of the reasons, in fact, why he has opposed cutting the fuel subsidies and devaluing the currency, because he said these things are going to feed inflation. Well, the reality is right now, inflation is running about 11%. He has, Emefiele has brought it down from about 19% in the last 2 or 3 years, which is an achievement. It's still way out of the target range between 6 and 9. So that's something that he's still got to push a lot harder on. The other big thing is the interest rate. A fairly conservative policy continues there. They cut the rate by half a point to 13.5 before the elections to give a bit of a fillip to growth, but no further cuts look likely. And if you think about that, because that factors through, that's the official policy rate. But by the time that gets onto the market for the local business to borrow from the banks, that's about 22% or more. So it's certainly not an easy banking system to borrow money from and make a profit on that. I mean, it gets back to that old saw that the banking system does not back productive investment. It only backs trading operations. And with interest rates, real interest rates of 22%, it's easy to see why. And the last policy that Emefiele is likely to continue with is this one of directed credit. Now, that's meant to be targeting loans to the agricultural and the manufacturing sector. Rather than the service sector, which is booming or certainly doing better than the other two, and again, it's regarded with horror by some of the more sort of conventional neoliberal economists who think it smacks of industrial policy and all the rest of it. I mean, the reality they need to confront is that it hasn't actually resulted an awful lot of credit going to industry or agriculture. In fact, the biggest credit expansion over the past 2 or 3 years has been to the public sector. The private sector isn't really in there. It's what it's doing is buying treasury bills and lending money to the government, which it considers to be the best form of credit risk available. So the banking system still isn't really serving the demands of a growing economy. Quite what Emefiele is going to do to change that isn't clear. But given the fact that he was CEO of one of the biggest banks, Zenith Bank, it'd be interesting to see what he says when he gets some questions.
Staying on the sort of the management of the economy, we've had the Ministry for Trade and Industry in Elama talk in soft terms about potentially joining the African Free Trade Zone. Is he just making the right noises because that's kind of what the zeitgeist is right now, or is there a genuine push to open Nigeria up to the rest of Africa?
No, I think there is a move. Of course, over a year ago, Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa turned up in Abuja and was advising, pleading almost with Buhari to sign the Africa Continental Free Trade Area deal. The deal is now ratified, and Nigeria is the biggest economy. Of course, it's the biggest economy in Africa, and it's the biggest economy outside the area. So I think there's a lot of push on the government to do that. And I think Nelema wouldn't have said what he said unless he'd had discussions with Buhari and Vice President Osibajo and the rest of the economic team. So I think it's a deliberate move. Having said that, the two other big players in this, the Manufacturers Association and the Labour Congress, don't like the free trade area. They see that Nigeria is going to lose out. It's going to allow a lot of cheap imports from other competitive economies. Morocco is viewed with some concern. And you remember there was a fuss over when Morocco tried to join ECOWAS, and Nigeria was strongly against that. So this is part of that. But I think despite the economic logic, Nigeria is a big enough economy to manage quite well on its own. It does, what does it need to sell to the rest of the region? Essentially, I think for all sorts of reasons that Nigeria is also styles itself as a big power in Africa. And therefore, it's got to be a good African citizen. And I think joining the kind of Pan-African trade project is an important one. I think you and I, when we last spoke to the president of the African Development Bank, Adewumi Adesina, is extremely keen on it himself. So I think my view is I think it's going to happen. And I think that it won't make a huge practical difference on the ground. I think it'll be a symbolic change. They'll join up. And I think much more important would be a push for more practical action within ECOWAS states for economic convergence, cutting down all the red tape and bureaucracy that slows down cross-border trading. I mean, one of the things they could do is that still you get all these police and customs checkpoints along the trade routes between West African countries. So I think they'd like to see that come to an end. And also, I think the question of facilitating financial transfers between states is going to come up again. And sure, common currency isn't likely in the short term, but I think you're going to see more attempts of economic convergence, certainly within the West African region, which on the economic front is still lagging behind the East African community.
How about the oil sector? Because I was in Nigeria 10 days ago, and one of the things that energy specialists kept repeating was that within 12, 24 months, Nigeria's production levels will go down significantly just because there hasn't been all the work that generally goes on to re-inject into old wells or to open up new production. And it risks falling off a cliff. What's the pressure like to get new sources of oil out of the ground?
I think there's a huge pressure on the government when they look into the medium term, and it's not a very happy picture in terms of oil production. Right across the continent, the other big producer, Angola, is seeing something similar. There's been difficult relations, to put it mildly, between the governments of Angola and Nigeria and the big oil companies, and a reluctance by the big oil companies to commit. So they've committed investment to some of the smaller producers in the continent. We've seen this upsurge of production in East Africa, for example. Then, of course, the big hydrocarbons projects in places like Senegal, Mozambique, now South Africa with a big gas find, Ghana with both oil and gas. So what seems to be happening is that the big oil companies are picking off these countries one by one and preferring to deal with smaller countries, smaller producers that have more leverage. They find, presumably, they get a better return on investment. I mean, they must have their reasons. So how Nigeria and Angola deal with that, I think, is going to be critical. Nigeria, most of all, not just on the oil story, but on gas production, which is absolutely a lifeline. But then the other big play that we were talking about when you were in Nigeria is about refining capacity. But I think to get to those issues of refining, gas production, etc., boosting exports, they've got to come up with a viable investment offer, and that means, in Nigeria's case, passing this petroleum industry bill through the National Assembly. It first surfaced a decade ago. And the strange thing is, it should really be a priority for any government in the country, because it's so central to the economy, not just to export earnings, but also the production of gas fire up the electricity generating stations around the country. And the longer the standoff goes on, the longer there's no agreement